In the essence of time, we will go ahead and move on to our next speaker, Dr. Lydia Hopper. Dr. Hopper is the incoming Director of Behavioral Management at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, where she will hold a faculty position in the Department of Molecular and Comparative Pathobiology. Her comparative research on primate cognition focuses on topics related to cognitive flexibility, social learning, and cooperation, and she leverages her findings to enhance captive primate care and welfare. Dr. Hopper will be giving a presentation on measuring and enhancing welfare through voluntary training tasks. Dr. Hopper?
Thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can see my slides okay. Yeah, it's my pleasure to be here. And I'm actually thankful to follow the two previous speakers because I feel like they've set up my talk really nicely. And like Dr. Deskovich said, I'm a primatologist. I've focused this talk on primates, but I have tried to include other species throughout. And I would also say that what I'm talking about are sort of general methods that really could be applied across species. So if I say primate or monkey, you can sort of translate that in your head for whatever species it is that you study. Also, yeah, so as was mentioned in the introduction, I'm sort of in a transition. I just wrapped up my previous job at Lincoln Park Zoo, where I was for nearly 9 years directing the research program there. So a lot of the work that I'm going to present today is actually work from the zoo. So I'll try and flag that as I go through. So what I'm going to talk today about, sort of slightly switching gears, is talking about sort of cognitive welfare, but I am going to be touching on emotions and affect, so following on from the previous two talks, but I'm going to be discussing other sort of metrics and ways that we can measure this in non-human primates and other species. And thinking about the concept of the 3 R's, what I'm going to focus on today is really refinement. So refinement of techniques that we can use to assess cognitive well-being in our primates, and seeing how that sort of interfaces with cognitive testing and training that we do with our animals. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about some additional tools that are have been used in other contexts and that I think could be leveraged for this assessment, but which haven't been done so far. So of course, we need to understand the welfare of our animals in our care. And because they are nonverbal, they can't tell us how they feel, what they need or what they want. So we're typically looking for outputs to make inferences about their well-being. And this not only informs us about their well-being, but also informs us about the reliability and the validity of the data that we are getting from them. Typically, it's common to use behavioral or physiological measures. And there's a number of sort of benefits of these. Oftentimes, particularly with behavioral observations, they're pretty easy to gather. They've often been pretty well validated. They're obviously cheap. But with both of these measures, there's also some limitations. Oftentimes, they can tell us changes in arousal, but not necessarily in the valence. And so it's really useful to, of course, use measures in combination, but to also use additional tools. And so that's what I want to talk today about, is not just measuring the arousal state of an animal, but actually also looking at the valence of that experience. So whether they're experiencing positive or negative welfare. And this is sort of the overview of the talk that I want to give today. So I do a lot of research testing primate cognition. So what I'm going to focus on is, can that cognitive testing itself enhance the animal's welfare? But can we also leverage that cognitive testing to assess their welfare? So can we sort of basically get a 2-for-1 deal here, where we're assessing cognition, but also assessing welfare? So a number of people have posited that particularly voluntary cognitive testing is extremely beneficial for the animals that participate. It's enriching cognitively to them. But really, we actually lack the data to say this. A lot of these claims are based on the fact that animals choose to participate in the research. So for example, there's a study from Washburn and Rumbaugh with macaques that said when they were given voluntary access to joystick tasks, they spent 40% of their time doing so. Similarly, Joel Fagot's lab has shown with baboons that, again, given free access to touchscreen tasks 24/7, their baboons on average would each complete 1,500 trials a day, showing that they want to participate in this research. But to me, that doesn't necessarily equate that it's enhancing their welfare, right? There's a lot of things that we choose to do. For example, I watch a lot of Netflix during lockdown. I'm not sure whether that benefited my welfare, but I chose to do it. So I think we need more rigorous measures of the actual efficacy of the benefits of this cognitive testing. So there have been some attempts to look at the interface between cognitive testing and welfare by looking at changes in activity budgets. So here are two examples, both with chimpanzees. So one is from Yumi Yamanashi at the Primate Research Institute in Kyoto, Japan, and one is from my group at Lincoln Park Zoo. And both of these studies showed that when chimpanzees were voluntarily participating in cognitive testing, their activity budgets changed such that species typical behaviors such as foraging and locomoting were promoted. So, and sort of indirectly to the task too. So this seems to suggest that there can be some sort of behavioral benefits, but I think it's interesting to look even deeper. So going back to those first two macaque and baboon studies that I mentioned, they both actually included additional measures of welfare. So what Washburn and Rumba found with their macaques was that these macaques that had voluntary access to joystick tasks, when that was removed, the macaque stereotypic behaviors increased. So here what we see is an increase in abnormal behaviors in the absence of the ability to engage in those tasks. Similarly, this is a photograph here of Joel Fago's lab. You can see the baboons and those sort of trailers in the background of the photograph. Each of those doors is a sort of entry booth to these individual cognitive testing setups. The baboons have access to 14 touchscreens that they can use, as I said, 24/7. But for a while, these touchscreens were unavailable to the baboons. And what was found was that the baboon's salivary cortisol was significantly higher when the access to the touchscreens was removed for this group, showing again a change in state in response to losing access to that touchscreen tasks. So again, these seem to suggest that voluntary access to cognitive testing does actually provide some welfare benefits. So, but can we actually use the touchscreens themselves to better understand the well-being of the animals? And so one way that has been used is to looking at the cognitive bias of an animal, which is an emotionally mediated cognitive bias. So in this way, this is taken from work done with humans and adapted for non-human species, showing that when an individual is experiencing a negative affective state, it changes their cognitive processing. So what an animal pays attention to, how they, what they remember, how they appraise their environment around them is all mediated by their internal state. And these cognitive bias tests have been developed for a range of species from insects to mammals. And I'm going to talk about sort of some of the methodologies that have been used today. The joy of these tests is that they allow us to compare across individuals within a population their affective state, but also it allows us to measure changes in individual animals in response to various interventions, environmental stressors, or we can use these measures in combination with other metrics of well-being. I do want to note, though, that there still hasn't really been good validation on the ability to use these measures in a sort of repeated way as a long-term baseline monitoring tool. And generally speaking, within cognitive bias, there's a number of different biases that can be impacted by affect, but judgment bias and attention bias are the two that have really been leveraged for assessing animal welfare, and that's what I'm going to discuss today. So I'm going to start with judgment bias testing. And essentially the premise of judgment bias testing is that an animal's judgment of their environment or the outcomes of a task are impacted by their welfare. And I'm going to use this example from Melissa Bateson's lab with honeybees to really demonstrate how this works. So the bees in this experiment were trained to conditioned on two different stimuli. So a positive stimuli, which was one odor, was associated with a positive outcome, which was a sweet food reward. And then there was a second stimuli, a different odor, that was paired with a negative outcome, a noxious food reward. And after exposure to these two different stimuli, this essentially created a go, no-go task for the bees, because when the bees smelt the positive odor, they extended their proboscis reliably to access the positive, the sweet food reward. But when they were exposed to the negative odor, they didn't extend their proboscis. So this is the dependent variable showing that they had learned that association between the different odors. And I should say for this study and all the ones I'm going to mention, the stimuli are always counterbalanced across subjects. Then what happens with the bees is they are shown they're exposed to intermediary smells, so mixtures of the two original smells that they hadn't previously been exposed to before, to see whether they would extend their proboscis. Essentially, do they rate this now neutral unknown stimuli, that's sort of a mixture of the two, as positive or negative? And so do they extend their proboscis or not? Half the bees, prior to exposure to these test stimuli, experienced a negative experience, which was being shaken on a vibration plate for 60 seconds. And the other half of the bees were control bees and had no such experience. And what was the test here was whether that experience, that negative experience, impacted the bees' interpretation of these new intermediary stimuli, these probe stimuli. And what this graph shows here is on the y-axis is the proportion of proboscis extensions, so the response variable. And on the x-axis, going from left to right, is the sort of degree to which the positive stimulus was shown or was exposed in the odor. So on the left is the most positive, was the positive odor. And of course, we see a high rate of the bees extending their proboscis because they have been conditioned that this smell elicits a positive food reward. And perhaps unsurprisingly, when they're exposed to the negative stimulus, there is much lower rate of them extending their proboscis. But what's really interesting here is there is an effect too of the experimental condition, such that in these neutral novel smells that were the intermediaries, the bees that experienced the negative condition of being vibrated were much less likely to extend their proboscis to these intermediary smells and going down with the more of the negative smell that it included. And so what this suggests is that these bees interpreted these unknown smells as more likely as being the negative stimulus, whereas the bees in the control condition were more likely to interpret the same smells as positive stimulus. For primates, these, instead of using olfactory cues, it's typically a visual cue presented on a touchscreen, and they're presented with one, for example, a very long bar that they are trained to press and get a reward, and a very short bar where they're trained to not press it. And again, they're then given these intermediary probe bars to see how they interpret these previously unexperienced stimuli. And it doesn't just have to be the length of the bar. I've seen this used with different shadings of color. And it can also be different auditory cues too, so different tones. And so when you're thinking about what the stimuli you want to train your animals on, you want to think about what their sensory modality is and what's appropriate for your study species. So primates are highly visual, which is why a lot of these tasks have been visual stimuli with primates. And the joy of using touchscreen tasks too is not only that the data are automatically recorded, what stimuli they press or not, but the latency of their responses can also be very accurately automatically recorded. Sometimes though, the go, no-go task is sometimes difficult to train, or you can get some sort of false negatives or false positives where animals just touch everything. So to sort of remedy that, Jennifer Vonk and her team have developed a number of alternative metrics. So this was a study that was run with gorillas, and the gorillas, again, counterbalanced across subjects, were trained that when they saw the white touchscreen, they should press the square on the left, but when they saw the black touchscreen, they should press the square on the right. But moreover, that the square on the left, when pressed, always resulted in a positive reward, so more food rewards than the one on the right. And so then the gorillas were shown these two squares, but now on sort of intermediary backgrounds, to see if the gorillas were more likely to press the left square, so to interpret gray as gray as white, or that they were more likely to touch the square on the right, interpreting it as the negative pairing. And in this instance, the sort of variable that the gorillas were tested in These were zoo house gorillas, and it was whether they had access to their outside yard or not. So to see whether that impacted these different individuals' responses to these stimuli. Of course, you don't need touchscreens. So often these sort of tests, particularly in agricultural settings, use physical tasks. So for example, the test setup on the top was run with pigs, and they're given a test arena and a bucket on the, again, counterbalance. But for this example, the bucket on the left has the positive food. So this was 3 positive preferred treats. And when a bucket is placed on the right, it has a negative food reward. So in this case, it was 3 coffee beans. And then the pigs, after being conditioned on these 2 locations, then a single bucket is placed in an intermediary location to see how long the pigs take to approach the different buckets. And again, the variable here was whether they were housed in enriched or barren enclosures. The bottom example, again, relies on a visual cue of these grades of white to black. And this was a study run with chimpanzees, but they literally used cardboard paper cones. So this doesn't need to be high tech. They literally presented sort of, yeah, these cutout cones that they presented to the chimpanzees. So the alternative, so those were the judgment bias tasks. So looking at how an animal makes a judgment about sort of a neutral stimuli. The next type of cognitive testing that's been used a lot is attention bias testing. And this essentially looks at an animal's attention to stimuli in the face of potentially stressful distractors in the environment. And this is a pretty evolutionarily conserved adaptation whereby our attention is drawn to potentially threatening things, and that is further mediated by the state that we are in. The outcome measures that we can use in such tests are delayed response to stimuli presented on a screen, and also sort of reduced accuracy too. Both of these measures have been used. The joy of these measures, unlike the judgment bias tasks that I was just describing, is that they typically don't require much training. So I talked in the previous set about you need to first condition them on the positive and the negative and then test them on these intermediary. Whereas with the attention bias testing, we're looking at really just their automatic responses to stimuli. So this can be a great way to collect data pretty quickly, and particularly in sort of test naive individuals. So this is a study that we ran at Lincoln Park Zoo a few years ago now, but that relies on this. This is a photograph of Lake Michigan. And in the far left-hand corner of this photograph, you can see there's a green, grassy, treed area. That's just the periphery of the zoo. So the zoo is right there. And every year we have a big air and water show that happens in Chicago. And you can see the contrails here of one of the planes as part of that performance. So you can see quite how close it is to the zoo. This is a very loud, unexpected, stressful period, and it lasts for 3 days. And the planes fly right over the zoo and then perform right in front of the zoo. So we wanted to see if and how this impacted the welfare of our Japanese macaques. Our Japanese macaques had arrived at the zoo the previous year, so this air and water show was extremely novel to them. They live in a big indoor-outdoor enclosure, so they're very exposed to these sounds, and they participate in touchscreen testing in 2 touchscreen testing booths that are adjacent to their outside enclosure. So again, essentially in an outdoor space. In this paradigm, this was based on Emily Bethel's work. We collaborated with her for a design that she had used previously with rhesus macaques, and we adapted it here for our Japanese macaques. The macaques are trained to press a gray square on the screen. Every time they do, they get a reward. It's a very simple task for them. Occasionally in that screen, an unknown conspecific face is shown to them. And what we see here is this is a threatening face, and it takes them longer to respond to touch that gray square. They still do, but it just takes them longer to do when there's a face in it as compared to when it's the neutral gray face. So that's sort of the test conditions that we had. And so this graph shows the differential response in the macaque's latency to press the gray squares with the face as compared to just the regular gray face. And what we find was that there was no difference as to whether that face was averted or straight on. But the importance for this particular study is that we tested them during the month before the air and water show happened. And then we also tested them during the air and water show itself. And what we found was that their responses to the face squares were even slower again. So this whole impact of their response slowing was attenuated by this external stressor. So not only do we find this attention bias towards the squares with the faces, it's exacerbated when the monkeys are under stress. And we have some case studies from later data showing this effect in other conditions too. So for example, we tested one female macaque after she had a stillbirth, and we found similar effects. So I think there's really interesting avenues to see how this might play out. So what I've talked about so far is two things. One, how when we're doing tests of cognition, we can collect additional data, behavioral data, to assess the welfare of the animals participating in that cognitive testing. I now just talked about how we can develop specific cognitive tests to assess welfare. But what I want to see also today is the last piece of the puzzle, and this is an area that I think has not been touched on really very much, is how when we're running just standard cognitive testing, we can use the outcomes of that testing to assess the animal's welfare. So not even using dedicated tests, we can use the standard tests that we are using anyway. This is almost like free data. So the example that I want to give for this, again, is our Japanese macaques at Lincoln Park Zoo. This is a photograph of their testing booths that you can see sort of come into the visitor viewing shelter. So the visitors stand very close to the macaques as they're participating in their research. On the right of the screen here, you can see a schematic of that visitor area and the macaque exhibit. And during the cognitive testing sessions, we collected data on where the visitors stood and then generated a heat map. And the red colors here indicate where most of the visitors were standing. And you can see it's along the perimeter of the macaque exhibit, but also right around those cognitive testing booths, which are shown here in the blue and the gray with the S and the N in them. That represents the south booth and the north booth. And so we wanted to see if the visitors represented a stressor for the monkeys. And I'm going to present the data here from two separate studies. I'm going to sort of, for brevity today, going to combine, but if you have questions, I'm happy to unpack them more because there's a lot of data I don't have time to discuss today. But the first set of data that we have is we continued testing the monkeys while the zoo was closed due to COVID-19 precautions. And then we continued testing when the zoo reopened. So we wanted to see whether the macaques' behavior changed when, after testing with no visitors present, they were then exposed to visitors being close by them. And the first thing that we looked at, so the two computers that the macaques can participate in the two booths have different codes in the data. So we could just look very easily at the raw data. This was a test of memory that we were running for other purposes. We could look just very easily at whether they had a preference for participating in one of the booths or the other. And our hypothesis was that if the visitors were a stressor for the monkeys, when the zoo reopened, the macaques would avoid entering that south booth, the S booth, that was closest to the visitors. And we didn't find that. In fact, we found that they completed significantly more of their test trials in that south booth after the zoo opened. So they definitely were not avoiding that space near the visitors. And Dr. Mankowski talked yesterday about the Syrian hamster model, about measuring the hamster's daily weights as a sort of nice metric for disease progression. This is data you're collecting anyway. And I argue that these sort of data are the same when you're training animals or testing animals in cognitive tasks. You're getting a lot of these sort of participatory data for free, and you're already collecting them probably as part of your metrics of cognition. But I encourage you to think about how you can use these data to think about the welfare and engagement of your animals too. We also have data, this is from the summer of 2019. Again, this was a test of memory, and it was a 6-month study looking at the macaque's ability to learn this pretty complex memory task. And in the first 3 months of the study, they're all performing right at chance. And so they're right at that 50-50 mark. And in the second half of the study, their accuracy in the task has increased significantly. But during the testing, every 12 trials that the macaques completed, we recorded the number of visitors that were in the viewing shelter. And what we found was that the number of visitors present mediated the accuracy of the monkeys in the second phase once they had learned the task, such that when the largest crowds were present, so over 40 people, the macaque's accuracy was significantly worse. So we don't think that the visitors were impacting their welfare, in that their engagement with the task didn't differ. So we were able to look at the number of trials they completed each day, and that didn't vary across over time or with visitors. So their likelihood to engage wasn't mediated, and their ability to learn wasn't mediated. But once they had learned, their accuracy was mediated. And I think this is important because this is a zoo setting looking at visitors, but in a research facility, there's often other things happening in the environment. And if we're trying to collect data, we want to know how reliable those data are. So thinking about the physical space and the potential stresses in that environment is not only important for understanding the primate's welfare, but also the utility of the data that you're gathering. So in my final couple of minutes here, I want to also flag that there are other tools that people are beginning to develop that I think we could layer on to the testing that we're doing to even better understand the welfare of the animals. Because I knew I was following two talks about facial coding. I haven't mentioned that here, but I think that facial coding is another tool that could be layered on. But the examples I give here are thermal imaging. So there's been a lot of emerging work with primates showing that measuring changes in nasal temperature can be a pretty reliable indicator of changes of affect. So the images you see here are changes in nasal temperature in chimpanzees in response to either auditory or visual playbacks. But this isn't just limited to large primates. So the bottom images here are from a study with marmosets. So this really has the ability to be applied across species. I've also done a lot of work using eye tracking technology to look at what animals are paying attention to in tests of memory. But I think this also has the option of being co-opted for use if we're trying to understand attention biases, to understand what animals are looking at. What is it that's distracting them in their environment? How much are they paying attention to the stimuli that we're giving them? So I think that these tools can be used in combination with each other and layered onto the standard testing or welfare measures that we are already doing. And I think thinking about this combinatory approach has great merit and strength. So in conclusion, I want to highlight that there's been a number of paradigms that have been developed to test animal affect and welfare, and that while touchscreens allow really sort of accurate and detailed measurements, you can actually use pretty low-tech alternatives. I want to sort of highlight caution that many of these techniques still need validating for use with other species or in different contexts, and particularly for repeated measurements over time. But I think the take home that I really want to highlight is thinking about all the metadata that you are already collecting, and think about whether this is in a cognitive testing situation or if you're training animals to engage with husbandry or medical procedures, or perhaps to take therapeutics. Think about how their training engagement or the latency that they have to approach the front of the cage, even very simple measures that you are probably already observing and recording, can be co-opted to understand welfare in that moment. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to give this talk. My many collaborators on the projects that I have described here, and my funders. Thank you so much.